This is the Thursday, May 20th, 2021 meeting of the Franklin Township Zoning Board of Adjustment. Franklin Township is operating under a declaration of state and local emergency due to the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. And it has been determined that the public's attendance at meetings of the zoning board would pose a risk to their health, safety, and welfare.
Hello.
Therefore, this meeting has been relocated from the council chambers at the Franklin Township Municipal Building to a virtual meeting format and is being conducted utilizing virtual/remote telecommunications equipment in conformance with the directives of the state of New Jersey. The relocation of this virtual meeting of the zoning board was posted on the township's official newspaper, the Courier News, on the township website, and within the municipal building. This notice detailed the following means of public participation in this remote meeting: link to the virtual meeting via WebEx, and a call-in number for those without internet access. Public inspection of the application materials was made available via the township website and/or in the planning zoning department in the municipal building. Formal action may be taken at this virtual meeting. Reminder to board members, please mute yourselves unless you wish to speak. Instructions for public input. For those members of the public that are watching via WebEx who wish to speak, please press the raise hand button. To use this feature, click on the participants icon in the lower right-hand corner of your screen, which will open a new participants window on the right side of your screen. In the lower right-hand corner of that window will be a hand icon. Click on the hand icon. For those members of the public that are listening via the call-in number who wish to speak, please press *3. At the appropriate time in the meeting, township staff will announce your name, unmute you, and you will have the opportunity to provide comment or ask questions. Please provide your name and address. If providing a statement, the board attorney will swear you in. After speaking, we ask that if on WebEx that you press the lower hand button, and if calling in, please press *3. I'll just say again that I would request that people, number one, refrain from raising their hand until, well, I'll take that back. After you're done speaking, I'll just reiterate, if you could please use the lower hand function. That way I can better identify who still needs to speak. Thank you.
Okay, would you call the roll, please?
Cheryl Bethia.
Here.
I don't know. Kraken. Bruce.
Go ahead, Bruce. Bruce, I unmuted you.
I see him. Joel Reese.
Here.
Alan Rich.
Here.
Gary Rosenthal.
Here.
Rich Propanik.
Here.
Kunal Lakia.
Here.
Asim Pradas.
Here.
And Chairman Thomas.
Here.
Okay.
We have minutes of the regular meeting, April 15th, 2021.
I move to accept.
Second.
Who's second? I'm sorry.
Gary.
Who's second?
Gary.
Okay. Bruce McCracken. Bruce. All right, I'll go back to Bruce. Joel.
Yes.
Alan Rich.
Yes.
Gary Rosenthal.
Yes.
Rich Propanik.
Yes.
Asim Pradas. Can you hear me, Vaseem?
Oh, now I can. I lost you there for a minute. Yes.
That's okay. Robert Thomas, or Chairman Thomas, I'm sorry.
Yes.
And Bruce, can you hear me? Bruce McCracken, can you hear me? All right, I'm going to put abstain for you. Go ahead, Mr. Chairman.
We'll go to the resolutions. Demetricus General Contracting, ZBA 20-00025. We need a motion.
I move to accept. I'll second.
Cheryl Bethia,
Yes.
Bruce McCracken, Joel Reese,
Yes.
Alan Rich,
Yes.
Gary Rosenthal,
Yes.
Rich Prokranik.
Yes.
Go ahead, Mr. Chairman, for the next. Mr. Chairman, you can go, you can't vote, you weren't here, so we're ready for the next resolution, the Copeland one?
Okay, Sharonda Copeland, ZBA 21-00004.
I'll move it, Gary.
Need a second?
I'll second.
Cheryl Bethia,
Yes.
Bruce McCracken, Joel Reese,
Yes.
Alan Rich,
Yes.
and Gary Rosenthal,
Yes.
and Richard Prokranik.
Yes.
Okay. Going on into the discussion part of the agenda. There's no issues there, and we have a meeting which I just lost the whole agenda again.
That's okay.
Side data.
Mr. Thomas, I'll do it for you. It's fine. I'll bring,
You have the particulars to read for carrying it.
I'm going to bring up the screen and I'll read it for you, okay?
It's good, thank you.
Okay. Did you make me a presenter, Mark, please? Thank you. Okay, let's move to 617. Okay. Psi Data Mandir Incorporated, ZBA 19-00037, preliminary and final major site plan with CFD variances in which applicant wants to construct a 28,970 square foot place of worship at 583 South Middlebush Road, Somerset, block 36.01, lot 6.03, in zone A. This, who's talking? This is carried to June 17th, 2021, with no further notification needed. For those of you wishing to participate in that hearing via virtual WebEx, the event address for attendees will be posted on the Township website at https://www.franklintwpnj.org/home/calendar/event 17595/2193. For those wishing to listen via telephone, the call-in number is 1-408-418-9388, and the access code is 173-687-7054. And this meeting, again, will be carried to June 17th via WebEx at 7:30 on that evening. All right, Mr. Chairman, go ahead.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Business for this evening, Data Bhagwan Vignan Institute, ZBA 19-00040, D3 conditional use variance, C variance and site plan, which the applicant is asking to construct a 21,083 square foot place of worship with a parking lot and 5-foot monument sign at 630 South Middlebush Road, Somerset, block 37.02, lot 46.03 in Zone A. This was carried from May 6, 2021, with no notification needed. Now, all we need to do is bring in all the interested parties and we can get started.
Okay, so I'll bring in Mr. Lanford at this time.
Good evening, Mr. Chairman, members of the board. Peter Lanford appearing on behalf of the applicant. I believe this is meeting 7 in this saga, which started in September of 2020. During the past 7 months, 8 months, we have presented to the board the testimony of our architect. We have had numerous meetings, meetings with testimony from our site engineer. We also have had testimony of the applicant and also our traffic consultant. This evening, I intend to present planning testimony from Mr. Kevin O'Brien in support of the grant of the D3 variance. And in addition, there is also a variance for a C variance for the sign. I would like to have Mr. O'Brien sworn in.
Before we proceed, Mr. Lanford, good evening. Mark, can you please promote Ms. Bailey and counsel, don't recall her name, escapes me for a second. There were the two.
Jennifer Narek. I'll bring her
Jennifer.
in.
Yep, Jennifer Narek, correct.
And Bruce McCracken's on.
Thank you, Bruce. If you could just mute yourself. Thank you.
Okay, I see Ms. Bailey. Ms. Narek is on. Okay. I do not see Mr. O'Brien. I see his name is on, but I do not see his picture.
Mr. O'Brien, can you turn your camera on?
Mr. Lanford, I would call him on my cell phone to help him out, but he's not on your list that was provided to me. So maybe perhaps you can text him or call him.
Okay, I'll mute myself.
I see you, Mr. O'Brien. You have to unmute yourself.
Okay, I'm going to hang up on Mr. O'Brien. You have him, counsel?
Yeah, I see his picture, but he's got to unmute himself. On the bottom end of the screen, you can see the mute button.
Mm-hmm.
There you go. Mr. O'Brien, can you hear me now?
Good evening, Counselor. Yes, can you hear me and see me?
I can, yes, thank you. Mr. O'Brien, I'm going to swear you in. If you can please raise your right hand. Do you swear or affirm the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Please state your name, spell your last, and provide us with your professional address, please.
My name is Kevin O'Brien. My address is Shamrock Enterprises, Madison House, Suite B, Madison Avenue in Rahway, New Jersey.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Counselor, and my apologies to the board. Every once in a while, this modern technology gets the better of me.
Mr. O'Brien, what is your occupation?
I am a professional planner. I am licensed by the state of New Jersey as such, and I am certified by the American Institute of Certified Planners.
We accept
And
his
you-
credentials.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Kevin.
Mr. O'Brien, this application tonight is an application, or this continued application is for a D3 conditional use approval. Can you indicate to the board what a D3 variance is and what the standards are with regard to proofs for D3 variance?
Yes, as the Zoning Board of Adjustment is quite aware, most of the cases that come before you are for D1 use variances, which is a variance for a use that is not allowed in the zone, the proverbial gas station in a residential area, in which case that is the highest burden of proof that has to be met, and you've got to go through the three-pronged burden of proof, which includes special reasons, which are based in the goals of the municipal land use law, the positive criteria rooted in the master plan and the zoning ordinance, and the negative criteria, which is the effect that the application has upon a neighborhood and the community at large. That's the typical case that comes before you. This evening, we are presenting a D3 conditional use variance application to you. And a D3 conditional use variance does not have to meet that same burden of proof because the governing body has already found that this use is allowed in the zone. If all the conditions in the ordinance are met, this application is approved by right, and off they go to the races. In this particular case, we do not meet a couple of those conditions for reasons that I will spell out, which is why we are here before your board for this conditional use variance. What is the burden of proof involved in a conditional use variance? I'm going to refer to the wonders of our camera to what the professionals call the Cox book. This is New Jersey Zoning and Land Use Administration. This is the reference book that your attorney, your planner all use in taking a look at planning case law and the guidance that we rely on how to present a case to a board. This reference book on page 746 of the 2020 edition has this to say about a conditional use variance. Quote, a conditional use variance applicant must show that the site will accommodate the problems associated with the use, even though the proposal does not comply with the conditions the ordinance established to address those problems. Therefore, what we must do is lay out what those problems on the site are, tell you how we accommodate them. And if we do so, then that is part of our burden of proof that the board is going to discuss and vote on later at some later time. Mr. Langford?
Okay, Mr. O'Brien, in addition to that, this application involves a house of worship. And can you enlighten the board concerning some of the issues that the board has to deal with houses of worship?
I think that there are two very important aspects to being a house of worship that the board will be considering in the course of their deliberations. And first is that a house of worship throughout the state of New Jersey is an inherently beneficial use. This state has found that houses of worship benefit all of our citizens in many, many ways. And as a house of worship, as an inherently beneficial use, much like a hospital or a school or something else that benefits the entire community. We do not have to prove the positive criteria because it is assumed under state law that we are a benefit to the entire community and the state as a whole. So we've already passed the positive criteria. So those two aspects of inherently beneficial, not needing to prove the positive criteria, are aspects that you're going to be considering in the course of your deliberations. So when you add the D3 conditional use burden and the inherently beneficial use burden, the primary thing that we are left with is the negative criteria. As an inherently beneficial use, the negative criteria is dealt with by you board members under a rule offered by the court here in New Jersey called the Sika balancing test. And that's a 4-pronged test to ascertain whether or not there is a negative impact and whether or not that impact can be addressed by the applicant.
Thank you, Mr. O'Brien. Now, before we get into the application itself, you are familiar with the zoning ordinance of the Township of Franklin? The
I
master
am,
plan?
Counselor.
Okay, you're familiar with the master plan of the Township of Franklin?
I am indeed. Mr.
Okay.
Healy did a fine job.
And you have visited the subject property, and also you have attended virtually all of the hearings that have taken place heretofore and have listened to all of the testimony of all of the previous witnesses. Is that correct?
That is correct, and I sympathize with the board members.
Okay. Now, I'm going to go and, because again, this has been going on for months, review the conditional use deviations before I let you speak to them. And in reviewing the conditional use requirements, we do not meet the D3 conditional use standards because the parking that is required under the ordinance, which requires us to measure the facility as if each and every parking space is occupied. I'm sorry, each and every space within the building is occupied, would necessitate 457 parking spaces. We are proposing 157 parking spaces as testified to by Mr. Ordman. In addition, in talking about parking, according to the conditional use standards, the majority of the parking shall be located in the rear of the main structure. In this instance, and no more than 10% shall be located at the front entrance. In this instance, with the church being relocated to the rear of the property, the parking is in front of the house of worship. When we originally applied, there was a building setback variance, side yard setback of 75 foot requirement. We were at 67.5 as a result of modifications to the plans which were put into evidence by Mr. Ordman. That variance has been eliminated, so we do not need that side yard variance any further. The rear yard setback, when we originally applied, the building was set 50 feet from the rear property line, where 200 feet is required. As a result, again, of discussions with neighbors and revisions to the plan, we still require a rear yard variance, but we have moved the building so the rear building is 130 feet from the rear property line. Finally, for, again, the conditional use standards, there is a buffer requirement. And this is a little bit lengthy, but I think it's important that we read it into the record. The ordinance requires a 15-foot buffer consisting of double staggered rows of evergreen trees planted a maximum of 10 feet on center with a minimum planting height of 6 to 8 feet or approved equivalent. A mix of evergreen and deciduous shrubs and a 6-foot-high solid board-on-board fence or 25-foot wide heavily landscape buffer with triple staggered row of evergreen trees planted at a maximum of 10 feet on center with a minimum planting height of 6 to 8 feet or approved equivalent, and a mix of evergreen and deciduous shrubs. Buffer requirements not fully, in this case, the buffer requirements are not fully satisfied in certain areas, and in certain areas we are providing that buffer. So those are the conditional use standards that we do not meet. And I think at this juncture, I will turn over to you and have you discuss the testimony that has been presented, the conditional use deviations, and then your opinions with respect to same. And if I have any questions as we go along, I will choose to interrupt you.
Certainly. Thank you, Mr. Lanford. And I agree with your assessment as to the conditional use standards. I was reading through them as you did. Thank you very much. There are a number of unique aspects to this application, including what Mr. Lanford was just discussing. Including the changes that have been made. And what Mr. Lanford was alluding to is the fact that when this application first came in last year, it was variance-free. However, it has lost its variance-free aspect because of changes made to the site in response to comments from the township, letters from the town, as well as interactions with the neighbors. Among the changes that have been made, are adding a 10-foot high berm with 8-foot pine trees in 2 rows at the rear to provide a screen of the proposed building to the farm. Added a fence along the rear property line on 2 sides adjoining the building, per Mr. Snyder's request, to keep people from wandering onto his farm field. Added planted evergreen hedge at parking lot towards front neighbor on South Middlebush to further block the view of the cars and any headlight impact. Removed the current driveway to the property along with the pipe at the street. Driveway will now be 300 feet from the Warwick's property and it will be posted for no parking. Provided additional plantings agreed to where existing driveway will be removed. Proposed street trees will be set back to ensure adequate sight distance along South Middlebush at the proposed driveway. A sight distance line is also shown from the Snyder's driveway to confirm that these trees don't obstruct their view. And by the way, board members, this is shown on the revised overall plan, sheet number 1, prepared by Mr. Ardman, that was presented in his testimony at the last hearing he was at. The proposed driveway only will be used as the construction entrance. The proposed parking lot lights shall be on a timer and separate circuits so that they will be lit only when necessary. Access to the existing house will now be from the proposed parking area closest to the house of worship. The house of worship will meet the 75-foot side yard setback requirement and be shifted to be 130 feet from the rear property line. As Mr. Lanford pointed out, it was originally proposed at 50 feet. We've moved it further away. We've added a note on the plans that the trees shown shall remain in the area specified at the house of worship and along the Snyder property line. A tree removal plan in our plan set will be updated accordingly, and we will abide by any standards regarding the tree clearing limitations. These changes have been made, as I indicated earlier, in response to township comments and to neighbor comments, and that is the reason why the parking is now in front of the house of worship. The township expressed concern that the scenic corridor along South Middlebush Road would be impacted by the sight of a building from the road. Let me quote from Mr. Healy's letter, which is written on May 21, 2020, and revised on 8th of January, on the 8th of January, 415 letter. There's a revision date on this, I'm sorry, and I'm not finding it right in front of me on the screen. The original date, however, excuse me, was the 21st of May, 2020. This is Mr. Healy's memorandum to the board. And I'm dropping down to page 5, item 2, site plan comments, item A, Alpha Scenic Corridor Ordinance. And in looking at the passage from Mr. Healy's letter, I read, quote, as indicated above, the site is located along a township designated scenic corridor, South Middlebush Road. Consistent with the design standards of the Scenic Corridor Ordinance, that is 112-201.g, y, a, and b, the overall site layout places the proposed building and forested areas within the forested area of the site, thereby preserving the open field vista aesthetic along South Middlebush Road. In particular, in my opinion, the overall site layout is consistent with section 112-201.g, parens 1, parens b, which states in part, colon, building location. The establishment of building envelopes and building sites in open fields shall be avoided. Existing tree lines, woodlands, and hedgerows that frame open fields shall be preserved and used to effectively screen new buildings from view or used to blend new development into the scenic landscape. Mr. Healy has indicated, and I quote, the overall site plan layout is consistent, unquote.
Okay, Mr. O'Brien, in going back, so again, we make the record clear, when this project was first started and a concept plan was developed, the church or house of worship was located in the farm field closer to South Middlebush Road. Was that correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay, and with that design, the parking was placed behind the house of worship.
In accordance with the ordinance, that is correct.
So with respect to that, that would have made the parking compliant. And again, in looking at what the township is dealing with and what the board is dealing with are many competing interests. We have a house of worship ordinance with certain conditions, and we also have a scenic corridor ordinance, correct?
That is correct.
And in trying to keep and work with both of those ordinances, it was recommended that the house of worship be moved where it is presently located. And as a result of that relocation, then the deviations do occur for the parking in the front yard, correct?
That is correct.
Okay. And also the deviations occur for the rear yard setback.
Yes.
Okay. And again, originally there would have been no rear yard setback variance required if the house of worship was located in the farm field.
That is correct.
Okay. Now, let's talk about the buffer requirement. You heard the testimony of Mr. Ardman, who described the property and described that there are 2 residents that have properties abutting our site, and around those residences are trees currently in place, mature trees. Is that correct?
That is correct. I'm looking at the aerial now.
Okay. And there is also, as described by Mr. Ardman, certain environmental constraints to wetlands in the rear, as you're looking at the property, right corner of the property, correct?
That is correct.
Okay, and then obviously on the other side is the farming operation.
Yes.
Can you address if the ordinance were to be complied with, to have the triple row or the double row of staggered evergreen trees and a solid fence around the residential properties, that would have to result, as Mr. Ardman testified, in the removal of the mature trees that are currently in place, correct?
That is correct, and that would be a significant number of those trees.
And in your opinion, based on the testimony of Mr. Ardman, with respect to those two residences where he testified that he thought it most prudent to leave the existing trees in place and supplement that area with additional plantings, and in addition, putting plantings in front of the parking area, in your opinion, is the spirit and intent of the ordinance met?
I believe that is, and if you take a look at Mr. Ardman's exhibit, sheet number 1, dated the 2nd of April, 2020, which I have in front of me, looks something like this, which is a superimposition of the site plan over the aerial. You can see where Mr. Ardman has filled in various gaps in the existing mature trees with additional landscaping, both behind the residences facing South Middlebush, as well as augmenting that landscaping along the driveway leading to the rear of the property to the proposed house of worship.
Now, also, as I indicated, in the rear portion of the property, there are wetlands. And Mr. Ardman testified that those wetlands could not be touched, correct?
That is correct. Woe to anyone who does touch them. They're in the
And-
southeast corner of the property as shown on the aerial.
So therefore, we could not comply with the buffer requirements in that area, correct?
That is correct.
We will be legally precluded from doing so.
In so many ways, yes, sir.
Okay, now that leaves then the buffer requirement around the Snyder property. And as you testified earlier, there are certain buffers that are being constructed by the applicant and proffered by the applicant around the area of the house of worship, including a berm, including evergreens, and including fencing, correct?
That is correct.
Okay, and then the rest of the area surrounding the farm, we are not proposing any buffering. Would you like to opine on whether you feel that buffering is necessary or appropriate in the areas adjacent to the farm other than where we are developing our house of worship?
Right, and if you take a look at the aerial that Mr. Ardman did supply, where the house of worship.
Would it help the board and Mr. O'Brien if Mr. Healy would put the aerial up? It is part of the previous exhibits, and maybe it would make a little bit of sense if he can make that available to everybody.
Guys, give us a few minutes here.
Thank you, Mr. Healy.
So just so Christine can find it, you're looking for which exhibit exactly?
It is dated the 2nd of April, 2020.
I think it's called revised or plan, or
So this is the concept plan, the revised concept plan?
that is correct, Mr. Healy.
Okay.
Keep going. It's further down. Hang on. I believe it is further down. Oh,
I believe you're into the side data application, which has been adjourned.
yep. Hang on. Updated plan. It said updated plan. Now I lost everybody. There was a document that said updated plan.
I think that's what's coming up.
So apparently you're just proposing some dash squiggly lines on the site, apparently?
Now, it appears if you look in the, if you look, I think over on the right side, the exhibit is there.
Yeah, it's just not loading.
It's not loading for some reason, but it's there. All right, let's perhaps try, while Christine's working on that, if she could bring it up, that would be wonderful. If we can't, we'll try to work around that. Mr. O'Brien, can you indicate to the board your opinion regarding the need or necessity of providing the buffering adjacent to the Snyder Farm in relationship to the areas that we are not going to be occupying? In other words, along the front of our property and along their driveway in an area which is also the scenic corridor. And looking at the scenic corridor ordinance, does the scenic corridor ordinance give us some guidance as to whether double rows of staggered evergreen trees are appropriate and fencing is appropriate and things of that nature?
Right. Whether this looks like it's slowly coming up. Should it come up when the board takes a look? There we go. At the right side of the screen, where the red squiggly line comes in from South Middlebush, comes in straight and then curves to the left of the screen. That whole area is open currently. There's nothing there. And what we are proposing is that that stays exactly as it is. When you look at the scenic corridor ordinance, that talks about, quote, existing tree lines, woodlands, and hedgerows that frame open fields shall be preserved and used to effectively screen new buildings. In this case, there's nothing there, so there's nothing to screen. There's no existing tree line. It is an open field. The framing of the open field is from the woodlands that surround it, which are on our property, but to the left of where the property juts out to the right or towards the north, that area where the red driveway has been relocated. That's all open field. To put something which would look unnatural as in a barrier, I think would just really take away from that scenic corridor. What we are proposing up in the front, up along South Middlebush, is screening to make sure that the house of worship and the attendant activities will be unseen from South Middlebush. So the adjoining farm, which the board knows is operating courtesy of several use variances, including the cell tower, including the commercial farm, the landscape and snowplow business. What is there to screen when there is an open field there now with something that I think is going to look out of place? If the intent of the scenic corridor ordinance is to protect the scenic corridor, having an artificial line of landscaping along a property line just would be out of place. Relying upon the existing trees that are there, the existing landscaping to screen that, I think is far more appropriate in this case, along with the augmented landscaping directly around the house of worship, screening it from the view of the farm.
Now, also, if we look at the Snyder Farm across from where, if we were to buffer along his property line, that's the driveway to the Snyder Farm, is that correct?
That is correct.
And adjacent to that driveway is, again, nothing but an open field, correct?
That is correct.
So there are no houses or activities along the front of that property that would, in your opinion, call for or require something to be buffered?
Yes, that's the thrust of my testimony.
Okay. Now, one of the other non-compliant conditions is the requirement of the 457 parking spaces. You've heard the testimony of the architect about the use of the building. You've heard the testimony of the representative of the temple who indicated that most of the activities on the weekends are going to generate anywhere between 75 and maybe on some weekends 140 people, and that during their twice a year program they're going to generate 250 people perhaps. Do you have an opinion as a planner, giving the size of the building, which is only 21,000 square feet, and the number of attendees, whether the board should consider granting the deviation of the variance for the 457 required parking spaces?
Yes, thank you. The premise of the parking ordinance for religious uses includes a 15 square foot requirement for each worshiper. This temple is large, as has been pointed out, with a lot of common areas. Every house of worship is different in its own way, and this one is unique in several different ways. There are Hindu temples that use floor space for seating. This particular one does not. It uses chairs and tables at times for cultural and other events such as lectures. The nature of this type of worship includes seated congregants on the floor, standing congregants, and folks sitting in those tables and chairs. And that is tough to quantify in an ordinance. And the applicant believes that more than sufficient parking is provided, as well as self-policing. There's no parking on South Middlebush. If congregants cannot be accommodated on the property, then they simply cannot go to the temple. Now, we don't believe that's going to happen, but to point out something that's very obvious, it's just, we just don't see it as a problem due to the fact that it is self-policing. You've heard the testimony from the applicant concerning the number of people who are going to be here. Mr. Lanford just alluded to that. This is unique as a Hindu temple in that they do not, they're more a learning center, a contemplation center than a place with fixed worship, much like you would find in a synagogue or in a Christian church, where people come in and contemplate rather than attend a particular service for a particular length of time. The temple is open certain hours during the day on Saturday and Sunday, and people come and go as they please in order to contemplate and worship in their own way. So I think that based on that, the parking is sufficient for what is proposed, for the proposed congregants of the church, and for the various uses, including those twice a year events where up to 250 people may be attending. And when you go with an average that most of planners, traffic engineers use of roughly 3 people in a car to a house of worship, then there is adequate, more than adequate parking for those folks.
Finally, there is one variance that is not related to the conditional use standards, but is the variance related to the sign. And again, to refresh the board's recollection, the sign that we are proposing has a sign area of 25 square feet, which is in fact permitted, but there are some posts and base to the sign, and the way the township calculates its ordinance or its requirements, it constitutes or calculates every element of the sign. You have and as a result of calculating all of those elements, the sign itself is 67 square feet, if I remember the number correctly. And would you have an opinion on the C variance for the sign?
Yes, I think that this is a de minimis exception, very comparable to other houses of worship within the township, something that is necessary for people to find this location. As was commented at the last hearing, South Middlebush is a busy road. People certainly need a marker to find it. And through the site plan application in front of you, we are doing our absolute best to hide this location from the view of a passerby. So a prominent sign at an appropriate location is something that is necessary to bring congregants into this location.
Thank you, Mr. O'Brien. Now, in having reviewed all of the deviations and the variances, can you indicate to the board whether the township master plan would give the board any guidance concerning this application?
Certainly, and I do want to reiterate that using the master plan is generally part of the burden of proof for a positive criteria. However, in this case, as we've indicated, the positive criteria has been met. But I do believe that there are several passages from the master plan that do buttress this application. Taking a look at the 2006 master plan, on page 1 of the community facilities element is this goal, quote, provide adequate community services and facilities to serve the needs of all current and future residents of the township. And it goes on to say, continue to provide adequate services to fit the needs of the township and continue to evaluate the adequacy of existing facilities. And this application supports that goal by providing a house of worship, an inherently beneficial use for all New Jerseyans.
Can you indicate to the board whether the municipal land use law gives the board any guidance concerning the application that is before it, or has been before it, and will continue to be before it for quite a while?
I do feel for the board. Yes, in terms of the municipal land use law, again, that's part of the burden of proof for a D1 use variance, in which we prove to you that we meet the special reasons aspect of the burden of proof. As a house of worship and as a conditional use variance, we don't have to meet that burden of proof. However, there are passages that do support us, and I think this buttresses our argument as to the not only the uniqueness of this application, but also the fact that this is something that the board can look favorably on. Among the passages in the municipal land use law, which are detailed in chapter 40:55D-2 of the municipal land use law, is item A, alpha, to encourage municipal action to guide the appropriate use or development of all lands in the state in a manner which will promote the public health, safety, morals, and general welfare. Item B, bravo, secure safety from fire and other disasters. G, golf, to provide sufficient space in appropriate locations for a variety of uses to meet the needs of all New Jersey citizens. And lastly, I, India, to promote a desirable visual environment. And I believe this application is consistent with those passages by providing a use that serves the public health, safety, morals, and general welfare, by providing an inherently beneficial house of worship. A new fully code compliant building will be constructed, which will have every conceivable safety feature and ensure the safety of congregants and neighbors. A desirable visual environment is maintained and protected by this application, placing all development over 850 feet away from the scenic corridor. And the phrase inherently beneficial use, as we discussed earlier, is a use which is universally considered of value to the community because it fundamentally serves the public good and promotes the general welfare.
Now, Mr. O'Brien, one of the things that we do have to, or you have to opine on in order for the board to grant a variance is that this application will not have a negative impact on the zone scheme or zone plan. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay, and can you indicate to the board your position with respect to the negative impact?
I can indeed. First, Mr. Lanford, do we need this exhibit up still?
It's up to you. If we can take it down, we'll take it down.
Maybe we'll wait for board questions, just because I saw how long it took for it to populate.
Okay, why don't we leave it up?
Yeah, okay. I'm sorry I raised the issue then. My apologies. So Mr. Lanford was asking about the negative impact. This is something that has to be proven to the board, but as an inherently beneficial use, the negative impact is judged in a different way. And that is through what is called a seek a balancing test, which has been offered to us by the courts as a way to gauge the impact that an inherently beneficial use will have upon the area and the township as a whole. And that's a 4-step balancing test. You know, the word balance is throughout our word usage, particularly here at the Zoning Board of Adjustment, because the board has to balance, as Mr. Lanford pointed out before, not only the various and competing ordinances that affect each application, but they have to balance the needs of stakeholders, the needs of an applicant, the various ordinances, the land use law, the master plan, all in arriving at a decision. The seek a balancing test is much like that in that we have to balance a number of competing interests. The very first step of those 4 is to identify the public interest at stake. In this case, the board will identify the house of worship as the public interest here because it is inherently beneficial use. The second step is to identify the detrimental effects that would ensue from the grant of a variance. In this case, the scenic roadway will be preserved and enhanced by removing the possibility of development in front adjacent to the road. Existing landscape will be preserved. Additional buffering is proposed towards the adjoining residences. So I don't see that there are detrimental effects resulting from this application. Item number 3 for the board to consider is whether or not you can determine whether it can reduce any detrimental effect by imposing reasonable conditions. Can the board put conditions on the application? Because I cannot identify any detrimental effects based upon the revised site plan that's in front of you, I don't see any reason to impose further conditions upon this application beyond what has already been offered and discussed in your discussions already in the course of this application. The 4th step is for the board to weigh the positive and negative criteria by balancing the public interest against the public detriment. In this case, the public interest of providing a house of worship outweighs the unidentified detriments. Therefore, I believe that this application passes the seek a balancing test, which gives the board the ability to pass the conditional use variance for an inherently beneficial use.
Okay, and finally, can you, have you reached, after reviewing all of the evidence and hearing all of the testimony, reached a conclusion on the applicant's request for the D3 conditional use variance and the sign variance?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Lanford. As we discussed earlier, a conditional use variance has a different burden of proof. And the Cox book says, show that the site will accommodate the problems associated with the use. So what we've shown you through the revised site plan in particular is that the site will accommodate this use, which is a conforming use, remember, by minimizing the nonconformities, protecting the scenic roadway, and providing substantial buffering to neighbors. Because this application is also for an inherently beneficial use, the special reasons criteria have been met. But in fact, we've also shown you that this application does meet goals of the municipal land use law, even though we don't have to show that. But we offer it as an additional justification for the board to consider this application. We meet the negative criteria by the Sika balancing test, and by weighing those detrimental effects against the public benefits, we see that there are no detrimental effects to nearby properties because the facility is particularly suited for the proposed use. This application meets the second prong of the negative criteria by meeting the goals of the land use law and the township master plan. So the burden of proof for this unique application is to show site suitability and meet the Sika balancing test. We've conclusively shown, I believe in testimony, that we meet both of those tests. In addition to that, we've also shown that special reasons do exist. We meet the goals of the land use law and the master plan, and we meet both of the goals of the negative criteria. Under the C or bulk variances for the sign, I believe that the sign variance can be granted under the C2 criteria in that the benefits of granting the relief outweigh any detriments. Plus, should the board grant a conditional use variance, any bulk relief would be included in the use variance approval. And I would state further that I believe this application can be granted without substantial detriment to the public good and without substantial impairment of the zone plan and zoning ordinance. Mr. Lanford.
Thank you, Mr. O'Brien. Mr. Chairman, I have no further questions of Mr. O'Brien.
Okay, board members, any questions?
Yeah. Okay, I don't know who mentioned this, whether it was Pete or Kevin. But under the, what do you call it, inherently beneficial? Now, a church is inherently beneficial, correct?
That's correct, Mr. Rich.
Okay. Now, is the application inherently beneficial, or are they two separate things?
No, the application for the church is an inherently beneficial application.
So if it's inherently beneficial, there's no way we can vote other than to accept it because it's inherently beneficial, correct?
I can interject there, Mr. O'Brien. So,
Thank you, Mr. Healy.
Mr. O'Brien has provided testimony that has really touched on different areas of the municipal land use law. The first one being this is a conditional use variance, which is the D3 variance. And essentially, the ordinance says the church houses of worship are permitted in this zone so long as they meet certain enumerated conditions. And they outlined 4 conditions that this facility does not meet. That is how this board should approach the review of this application as a D3 variance. What Mr. O'Brien is testifying to is essentially buttressing his testimony by saying this is also an inherently beneficial use, which presumptively satisfies the positive criteria, a normal type of use variance applications that this board customarily sees. In that instance, the positive criteria is presumed because it is so beneficial to the surrounding community. Things like hospitals and schools and churches are deemed to be a promotion of the general welfare. They don't have to show that burden. But you also always have to show that there is no negative criteria. So to answer your specific question, this applicant has to show, number one, as a D3 variance, that they meet all of the conditions, and they don't. There's 4 of them that they do not meet. Can the board impose reasonable conditions to ameliorate or mitigate those nonconformities? And if they can, they should. And does the nonconformities essentially rise to the level of being so substantially negative to the public good or to the master plan, the intent of the master plan, that it tips the scales in the favor of the negative, so you can deny the application? If it doesn't, if it is still remains that the conditions are really so meek that conditions can be imposed so that the site is still appropriate, or the facility in this location is still appropriate, and there is no substantial detriment, then the board can approve it. It's not an automatic. Just because you are an inherently beneficial use does not mean the board has to automatically approve it. You still have to evaluate the negative portion of the criteria, which is substantial detriment to the public good, substantial detriment to the intent of the zone plan and the master plan, the zoning ordinance and the master plan. Mr. O'Brien, feel free to join in. That was, I'm putting words in your mouth. I hope I didn't mischaracterize your testimony. If I did, please feel free to clarify.
Not being an attorney, I can only echo what you said, and you've done a fine job of summarizing. I appreciate it, but as a mere planner, I can only echo that. But I would want to point out to Mr. Rich that the reason those conditions are there in front of you for the conditional use variance is all part of that balancing that I talked about earlier, and that we have balanced the need of the scenic corridor, and therefore we put the house of worship all the way in the back of the lot so that we would shield it from that scenic corridor. The reason that we are not putting up the buffer that's required is because we would have to rip down existing mature trees to put up new saplings and fence. The reason this application is in front of you the way that it is because that we have tried to balance the needs of our neighbors, of the scenic corridor, with the needs of the applicant. So instead of coming in with that original application, which was fully conforming, and it's tough to turn down a fully conforming conditional use variance, depending upon the negative criteria, as council points out. But in our case, we came in that way, but because of balancing the needs of everybody, we now need those conditions to be passed, to be looked at by the board, because we're doing it ourselves in response to trying to make this a better application for the neighbors in the township.
You did not make the statement that there was no negative criteria. I thought I heard that.
Perhaps what you heard me was that I said that there are no identifiable detrimental effects. We do meet the negative criteria by stating that there are no identifiable detrimental effects to impose conditions on. That's part of the SECA balancing test.
Okay.
If I've confused you in some way, Mr. Rich, I apologize. I'm happy to clear it for you if I can.
One of the ways I think you could deal with one of the variances in terms of the parking I'm thinking of, since surface you're required to have quite a bit of parking, you're proposing substantially less. But I think, and also, as your applicant stated, the use of this facility seems to be pretty minimal, which we don't know how that will work down the road. But I would propose conditioning the parking in the sense that every car or vehicle must be parked in a parking spot, a designated parking spot that's designated on the plan that you show before us. There would be no overflow parking if there were an overflow crowd on any grassy areas, any undeveloped land. And in particular, there would be never any parking on the driveway on the way out to South Middlebush Road. And if for some reason there was a big crowd and everything was filled, then it is absolutely incumbent on the applicant to police it and turn people around and send them back out home. Parking should be nowhere on the property other than in designated spots.
I can briefly respond to that. I agree with your assessment, and I think if you heard the testimony of Ms. Dolan at the last meeting, she had indicated that she felt that the parking that we are providing, the number of parking spaces that are going to be there are going to be adequate to handle the needs of the congregation. And also, if you reflect back to the meeting before that one, where the representative of the church indicated that if, and they don't have them, but if they were ever to have some sort of a large event, it wouldn't be on this site. We also had indicated that we would agree that at those 2 events per year, where we do have a larger attendance than the every weekend event, we would meet with the township to determine whether a police officer would be necessary to help control and monitor the traffic. And if in fact the parking lot does get filled, which again, we don't envision ever happening, then obviously the police would not let anybody on site to park in areas where they're not supposed to be parked. And those conditions, I think, are, reasonable and appropriate for the board to impose.
I don't think, based on your client's testimony, it's reasonable to assume that the parking will
Can you speak up, Bob?
have enough spaces, but we're considering approving a facility that, is likely to be here for the next 20 years or so. So we don't know what's going to change in the meantime. If something does, then they're free to come back to the board and ask for relief in different ways. But I do pretty much feel strongly that I'd like to see that condition more formal than just a verbal agreement. There should not be parking anywhere other than in designated spaces. And if there's parking in the driveway, for whatever reason, that totally negates preserving the, scenic corridor. But thanks for your input there. Are there any other board questions?
Mr. Chairman, if I may, I think that you touched on something that could also be added as a reasonable condition. At the last meeting, as Mr. Lanford indicated, on the high holy days, he agreed with the client's agreement that they would meet with the town to go through a review, submit an application to determine whether or not they needed police at that driveway. The question came up, well, how would we know that we would need police? And Mr. Lanford came up with a really good idea of, well, we'll meet with the town before we have those kind of big days. One thing that we've done in the past, it was another application, and it was during this COVID time, for a facility that housed houses of worship, similar to this, where it was almost a ongoing event during the course of a day. That facility had something of an online registration, and that way they would space out the parishioners, so that way you can better control the parking flow by controlling the times of the event for the people to come. A point of consideration, I would like to get the applicant's take on something like that, if it would work for their 2 high holy days of the year, if it could be done by reservation, pre-registration, and that could be something that could be brought to the town as well during the review process.
I don't think it is ultimately necessary given the size of the congregation and the number of parking spaces. But having said that, again, when we meet with the town, and I've been involved with other houses of worship in this town who have large events and again had larger congregations. And it turns out that the police, fire, health department all get involved in the meeting, and I've attended some of those meetings. And based on what the applicant anticipates, the police will impose, certain conditions, restrictions, and things of that nature so that the event would work effectively and properly and safely. And then what happens is, if we go back the next year, you learn from the year before, and sometimes certain additional conditions may be imposed or conditions may be relaxed, given what took place the year before. There are some houses of worship that my clients had to go back 2 or 3 years, and after a while, there was no need to have these meetings any longer because there was a system in place to handle these events. So I am not saying that we should or should not have a lottery system or a call-in system, but I don't think it's necessary initially. But if the police, in reviewing what the event is going to be and the anticipated attendance, think something like that may be appropriate, I think that's something for them to decide and may be appropriate given the circumstances. But I don't think it should be a condition of approval. I think that's one of the tools in the toolbox of the police and fire department in reviewing how this facility would function.
Okay, other board questions?
I have
Yes, I
a
do.
couple of quick questions. So we touched on the house of worship and it's inherently beneficial. In order for it to be considered a house of worship, based on the MLUL or whatever governing bodies, does it require a state or a federal designation of a church or synagogue house of worship?
We are a 501(c) registered with the federal government. We are a religious institution. I can provide the documentation to the planning board office if the board feels it is appropriate, but we are a registered religious organization.
Okay, thank you. Yesterday, and this is kind of coming back to the parking situation. Yesterday, there was an incident on South Middlebush where a pedestrian was struck by a vehicle. So I think anyone who is aware of that, it's a slightly more sensitive issue today than it was perhaps at the last meeting. So I do just want to express my concern about pedestrians walking across South Middlebush, which there's no sidewalks, there shouldn't be, and then up the driveway. But the individual that was struck did die. So it is a quite serious and dangerous situation on South Middlebush at times. With more direct to the parking, just an option or an idea to the applicant and for the rest of us board members to consider is, perhaps the parking could be enforced by the police. You can opt into that, or some striping along the curb on the pavement, similar to fire lane, no parking, but just a no parking. So I just wanted to offer those two as suggestions, and that concludes my comments.
Mr. Lanford, that would be application of Title 39 on the site. Would you?
I have no problem with applying Title 39, and for the board members, that means if somebody on the property violates a motor vehicle statute, the police have the authority to issue summonses, which they normally can't do without that authorization on private property. Also, I think we can put, we got to be careful. I think some signage may be appropriate, but again, we're talking about a scenic corridor, and I don't think you want to clutter the site with signs, but I think perhaps as we get into the site and we can work with the engineering department or the police to put some signage up deeper into the site indicating that parking must be in the parking lots only, or something that affects so that the people coming know that they have to park there. And then the other thing that you really need to consider is that it's basically the same people that are coming every week. So, there may be a stranger from time to time, but it's not like somebody is just driving down the street and going and sees a shopping center and pulls in and says, I'm going to go here and buy something. It's the same members of the congregation that come. So they should be well aware and educated as to what their responsibilities are and where they should park.
Okay, other questions?
Yeah, I have a question. This is based on an earlier testimony, and please correct me if I'm wrong, that the traffic pattern as studied was in isolation, not considering the temple on the other side, or the other institute on the other side that is also being proposed.
That's inaccurate. Ms. Dolan testified last month. Ms. Dolan testified last month, or actually 2 weeks ago, that she is the traffic engineer for the other facility also, that she reviewed the two facilities in concert and reviewed the projected traffic from that facility and this facility, and concluded that South Middle Bush Road can handle both of those facilities. And again, ultimately, it is subject to the review of Somerset County because they have jurisdiction over that road, which is a county road.
Okay, thank you for clarification. I just wanted to make sure that it was not in isolation, just revising. Thank you.
Okay, other questions?
Mr. Chairman, I have just a couple follow-up questions for Mr. O'Brien. Mr. O'Brien, you had stated that this is a D3 use variance, correct?
D3 conditional use variance, correct.
And that's really the primary focus, not necessarily the inherently beneficial or the site suitability. You use those as kind of wearing the belt and the suspenders in terms of your planning analysis, but this case really falls into that D3 conditional use analysis, correct?
I think that's the primary argument that we've made this evening, but I think it's very, very important for the board to consider the inherently beneficial aspect because that's what leads to the seek a balancing test in terms of the negative impact, which is a very important part of the burden of proof that the board is reviewing this evening.
Okay. One of the conditions that kind of is both in the D3 and flows to the negative criteria is the parking, correct?
Yes.
Okay, and the parking is 457 parking spaces required and 157 parking spaces proposed, correct?
That is correct.
And that's based on section 112-37D1, which calculates 6,864 square feet and 15 square feet of space per parishioner for a total of 457 spaces. Is that correct?
I don't have the site in front of me. I rely upon you, Mr. Lagana. I have no reason to disagree.
Okay, now you provided some testimony regarding why this facility doesn't fall squarely within that analysis because it's not utilizing the entire square footage of the building because a lot of this building has different types of storage areas and office space, and it's not entirely being used as houses of worship, correct?
I think that's part of it, but the primary reason for this amount of parking being proposed is because that's what the temple believes they're going to need. Please remember, board, that this is a 16-acre site. You've seen the aerial in front of you. If you take that whole northern area, which currently is vacant land, it is not forested, there's no reason that they can't provide several hundred parking spaces there. But it would ruin the scenic corridor. It's not needed. It's unnecessary. It would be expensive. So by choice, this applicant has decided to provide the parking that they think is needed in this case and not more.
You had stated that the parishioners, because of they don't need all of that parking space, because in this particular facility, it includes some seating, but patrons also sit on the floor, and other patrons sit at tables, and there's chairs, and it's not quite utilized in a traditional, say, church setting. Correct? That was your testimony?
That is correct, and I think also important to this particular application is that this temple is, let me back up. This board has heard many Hindu temples throughout the years, each of which is dedicated to various different deities. There are some temples that worship common deities, and there are some that don't. This particular one has a unique blend of deities that they worship, and there is no other temple in the United States that worships the deities that this congregation does. So this is a unique temple of its own, and this is one of the reasons why the various types of seating are available, and also why this is a house of contemplation and not one of a religious service, as one would think of in a Christian, Muslim, or Jewish house of worship.
Okay, so going to the ordinance now, I'm just going to read this in, and it's 112-37D1, and it reads, parking requirements, 1 parking space per every 3 seats. Now, that's not the criteria that's being used here. It kind of goes on from there. It says 1 seat shall be considered 22 inches in calculating the capacity of pews or benches. So that's giving the measurements if this is a traditional, say, Christian church that uses pews or benches, but that's not what's being proposed here. So that part of the ordinance doesn't necessarily contemplate this type of use. In the event there is no seating provided, parking shall be provided at 1 parking space for every 3 persons at the largest anticipated gathering, or a minimum of 1 parking space for every 15 square feet of worship area. In your opinion, do you believe that this ordinance contemplates multiple types of houses of worship?
It does. Any land use ordinance is a one-size-fits-all. No township can write so many different variables into that ordinance and address every single possibility. Otherwise, there'd be no reason for a zoning board of adjustment.
Correct. Or an attorney.
We'll put us all out of work, Mr. Lugano.
So therefore, using the one section of this ordinance, which requires 1 parking space for every 15 square feet of worship area, do you believe that that is the most accurate, or I should say the most relevant part of the ordinance that this board can look to when determining whether or not that one condition under the D3 standards is being met?
I think this comes closest to this particular application, yes.
Okay, thank you. I have no further questions, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Lugano.
Okay, I just wanted to clarify something on the site plan. This isn't necessarily directly related to planning. The existing driveway that's there today,
Bob, please speak up. It's hard to hear you.
the existing driveway that's in existence now that leads back to the house that's on the site, that is going to be abandoned, correct?
Yes, it
That
was
is correct, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, it was testified by Mr. Ardman, and this plan sort of shows it. That driveway will not only be abandoned, it will be, there will be trees planted in that area, and it will also be abandoned before we start work so that the construction of the facility will be using the new driveway so that there will not even be construction traffic coming down that driveway to construct the facility.
Okay, if there's no other questions, we can look to open to the public. And before you do, how's my volume now, Mark?
Yeah, good. Thank you, Bob. Actually, Bob, if I could ask Mr. O'Brien a few questions. Before I do that, I will remind the public that we will be opening up soon to you. And if you have any questions for Mr. O'Brien based on his testimony, you can do the raised hand function in WebEx or press *3 if you're calling in. Mr. O'Brien, the inherently beneficial status of a house of worship, is that spelled out in statutory law, like the municipal land use law, or is that or is that from case law?
The church aspect is spelled out in the statute. One moment, I'll have your citation on that. Mr. Healy.
It's defined in D4, sir.
I'm sorry?
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. I think you had it. It's defined in the definition section.
Yes, that's correct. 40:55D-4. Among the recognized uses are hospital, school, child care center, group home, house of worship, or a wind, solar, or photovoltaic energy facility or structure. They are spelled out in the statute.
And that's by statute, mean the municipal land use law.
That is the municipal land use laws adopted by the legislature of the great state of New Jersey.
Okay, and I'm sure there's a volume of case law that substantiates that as well.
I believe that the Cox book has several appendices devoted just to that.
Okay, housekeeping issue. And I believe there's a chance Mr. Ardman addressed this months ago, but my May memo identifies a variance for the mounting height of the lights, 15 feet. And I guess the plans that were proposed were 17.5. Has that been amended to go away?
I believe it has. I'm
Yeah,
sorry,
my
Mr. Lanford.
Yeah, my recollection is Mr. Hardman indicated that the lights would be reduced in height to
Okay, so
comply
that
with
is
the ordinance.
so that is no longer a variance. Thank you. The driveway as now proposed to go through the field. Do you recall if Mr. Ardman testified, would there be lights to along that driveway? And if so, how many and how tall?
There weren't any proposed, and I think it would be up to the board. Normally, there should be a light, my experience in having done these, at the intersection of the driveway and South Middlebush Road so that people can see the driveway and vehicles can safely exit. We may want to defer to engineering as to whether they feel some lighting along that road is appropriate or not. We haven't proposed it.
Okay, and I would opine that per the scenic corridor ordinance, that lighting should be the absolute minimum along that driveway. I think what Mr. Lanford stated at the entrance may make some sense for the reasons that he just stated. Otherwise, I think it should be the minimum possible so that basically it looks just like a driveway like any other. Maybe a little bit wider, but nonetheless not a commercial looking driveway.
And just if you may recollect, Mr. Healy, we indicated that basically Saturdays we're going to be there till 8 p.m. and in the summertime there's no need for the lighting. On Sunday we're only there from 10 to 2 p.m. And on one Saturday a month we're there till 9 p.m. So there's very little need for lighting. So I guess if we discuss it with engineering, we probably can indicate to them that we don't believe lighting is necessary, and if there is, it would be minimal.
And they may wish to consider, Mr. Healy, that instead of lighting, the liberal use of cat's eyes and reflective striping on the roadway would be adequate to guide motorists up that driveway.
Okay, thank you. And then my last question relates again to parking. So, and I asked Mr. Ardman a similar question. The calculations that are on the site plan comes up to a requirement of, the site plan cites a requirement of 153 spaces. And that was based on the quote largest gathering of 458 people. Do you know where that figure came from?
Mr. Ardman testified that basically if it was a seated facility and they did the calculations based on a seated facility, you'd get 458 people in there, and then he divided that number by 3.
Okay. All right. So then based on that, Mr. O'Brien, you've heard that the largest event will be 250 people, and that'll occur twice a year or 2 days a year. And then all of the other events will be less than that. Is there any reason from a planning perspective that 153 spaces needs to be proposed?
Here's your balance, Mr. Healy. Quite possibly not. On the other hand, does one anticipate future growth? Now, the temple says that they don't need them. As a planner, I can have an opinion, but I've got to defer to the operational use of the temple as to what they think they need. And also as a planner, I would also add that whatever they think they need, there should be some additional so that folks who have been on this meeting in the past who have worried about parking along South Middlebush or elsewhere can have their concerns addressed, that there's no possible way that there will be parking off this site.
Okay, so, and you cited before the standard that frankly I've seen in probably every single land use ordinance that I've ever reviewed in my career, which is one space for every 3 seats of a house of worship. So I've never seen a standard that differs from that, to tell you the truth. So if you divide 250 by 3, that's 83 spaces.
Yes.
And again, 153 are proposed. And then you mentioned the possibility of, I guess, the emergency situations where maybe there's more people or a growth. In such instances, I've seen boards incorporate land banking of spaces. Do you see any reason why that shouldn't be imposed or incorporated into the site plan?
From a purely planning perspective, I see none. Mr. Lamford has a deeper understanding of the applicant's needs. He may wish to address that. And by the way, I do want to add that I think Harvey Moskowitz wrote that three seats back in about 1952.
If I may, I did discuss this with my client. And also, I think if we go back to all of these hearings, and even Mr. Thomas's comments tonight, that he wants to make sure that, you know, everybody who comes on the site parks in a parking lot and doesn't park on the fields or parks in the roadways. So we have to balance to create enough parking, but maybe not create parking that may not be necessary. I think if we look at this layout, I think what probably makes the most appropriate sense is to approve all of the parking spaces that are set forth therein, but to bank the section, the aisle closest to the 2 residential dwellings, so that those spaces will not be built unless they're necessary. And again, that provides additional buffering to the neighbors, but yet if there is some growth in the future, those spaces would become available. And I think that would handle the day-to-day operations. It would handle the major events with the congregation that they have now. And it also affords them that if they need to build the other spaces, they can build them, but not build them right away.
So those are my questions, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you,
Okay,
Mr. Healy.
Any other questions? Open to the public then, if you're not any takers.
Okay, I do see somebody with their hand raised. Again, I'll remind the public to use the raised hand function, WebEx, or *3 if you're calling in. I see Barbara Lawrence with her hand up.
Mark,
May I just interject?
Mark,
Oh,
yeah, do
I'm
we
sorry.
want to go to council first?
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's
Dan?
correct.
is
I'm
that-
sorry. Yes, I'm sorry.
We've been forgotten. I'll go first.
Never.
Yeah. Sorry, Ms. Lawrence, we'll get back to you.
Thank you. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen of the board, Mr. Chairman Thomas, and thank you, Mr. O'Brien, for your testimony. My name is Martina Bailey. I represent John and Ray Snyder, who own the farm on the northeast side of the site.
Good evening, Ms. Bailey.
Good evening, thank you. With all due respect, if there were no identifiable detrimental effects, I wouldn't be here tonight, and neither would the other neighbors and many members of the public who have come out and questioned and also signed a petition in opposition to this. So with all due respect, I think there are some very serious concerns that we're here to address and ask more questions about. I appreciate your very clear distillation of the D3 conditional use standards, and I wish it were that clear. And at the risk of complicating things just slightly, I want to pick up on something that you talked about, and that is the way that the positive criteria is treated with respect to inherently beneficial uses. And what you said was that New Jersey state and the law treats inherently beneficial uses, as far as the positive criteria goes, as meeting that criteria. And so it lessens the burden of proof, and it's not the same burden of proof as a D1. And I want to draw your attention. I have the same Bible here that you pointed to. There is a statement here that complicates my understanding of that, and I just want to get your response to that, because I think it's relevant to the board's understanding of how that criteria that positive criteria should be considered. I just want to be clear, I'm not questioning whether a house of worship is considered an inherently beneficial use. I think that is that's not what we're talking about here. What I'm questioning is whether the positive criteria that normally applies to a D3 conditional use is presumptively met by an inherently beneficial use. And I agree that there is certainly authority that it does, but I think it's much less clear than you've presented it. And there is reason actually to believe that that presumption doesn't apply to inherently beneficial uses, which means that the positive criteria does have to be discussed and met, or that the presumption really can be overcome with less of a burden of proof than you've suggested. I'm just going to point, and I'm sorry to get a bit technical on you, but I think this is important. I'm just going to point to a section of Cox that you referred to earlier, and this is in 32-5, which talks about the inherently beneficial uses. And there's a statement, and it's a little bit buried here, but, and I'm looking at page 709 of my edition, where it states very clearly that it should be noted that the inherently beneficial use doctrine generally applies only in those cases seeking a variance to permit a use or a principal structure in a district restricted against such use or principal structure. The issues and considerations applicable in the D cases enumerated as 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, and 3 is the one that we're talking about here, are mostly quite different from those applying to the traditional use variance cases. What I think that means is that while I think it's fairly well established by case law that that if you're talking about an inherently beneficial use and a house of worship in this case, that you can safely conclude that the positive criteria is met without necessarily going through the same burden of proof that you ordinarily would have to go through if you were talking about a non-inherently beneficial use.
Ms.
Can I
Bailey,
just
if I may,
yeah.
I don't mean to interrupt you, but I want to follow you. Where are you on page 709?
It's about a third of the way down the paragraph starting. It should be noted that the inherently beneficial use doctrine generally applies only in those cases seeking a variance to permit a use or principal structure in a district restricted against such a use.
Okay. I read it. Thank you.
Can I just get your reaction to that? Because I read that and it utterly confused my understanding of how inherently beneficial uses are to be treated when it comes to the positive criteria. I don't know if you've come across that, but I wonder if you can comment on that and help me and the board understand what to make of that.
Sure. My mother told me never to brag, and I don't intend to here, but let me give you the benefit of some of my background, which may help explain my answer. I have been a planner since the mid-1980s. I had the opportunity to work with Bill Cox for about a dozen years through the New Jersey planning officials, as well as on one of the land use committees. Bill Cox was one of the first people to admit to all of us that as this book was written by him initially, that there were certain areas that might be considered a bit gray. There might be considered a bit of a contradiction. And if those of us who recall when Bill unfortunately passed away in 2010, that the authorship of that has been passed along to some extremely qualified individuals who have revamped that book. That statement is there. There's absolutely no denying it. Ms. Bailey has put it out in front of us. However, practicing planners such as myself, when dealing with this type of an application that comes before the board, rely upon the other aspects that have been noted in other areas of the Cox book, which I believe specifically address both the inherently beneficial uses as well as the conditional use variances. And that's the testimony that I rely on this evening.
Okay. is it fair to say that there could be a difference of opinion on how the standard that you've described can be applied?
No, I don't believe so. I haven't heard an inherently beneficial or a conditional use variance treated in any other way than I've seen this evening. And perhaps you might want to ask the board planner if they've seen it treated differently.
Is that a question that I may put to the board planner, Mr. Lagana?
You can ask Mark, but I'm going to swear you in, Mark. I think we've pretty much swore you in from the beginning of the year, but because you're providing some testimony, I'm going to swear you in. Do you swear or affirm the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do, and for the record, I am professional planner in the state of New Jersey and also a member of the American Institute of Certified Planners.
Thank you, Mr. Healy. So the question again, I'll try and make this as clear and simple, given the complexity of this, is really, is a D3 conditional use variance and the standard that is typically applied when it comes to just the positive criteria. I'm not talking about the negative criteria, which Mr. O'Brien went through very thoroughly, but just the positive criteria, which under Coventry requires which requires a showing of special reasons and site suitability. Is it your understanding that an inherently beneficial use is always given the benefit of a presumption that it meets that positive criteria?
Well, I think the way that I would answer this is that it's my understanding that the first thing that the applicant needs to prove as far as the positive criteria for a D3 variance is that the site, well, let me take a step back. If it was a D1 variance, the applicant would have to prove that the use is particularly suitable for the use, despite the fact that it's not a permitted use. Here, this is a permitted use in the zone, but they do not meet certain of the conditional use standards. So then, instead of proving that the site is particularly suitable for the use, they have to prove that the site remains suitable for the use despite the deviations. So my understanding is that's really what Mr. O'Brien needs to prove. The fact that he's bringing up that it's inherently beneficial, I think could be characterized as Mr. O'Brien's, I think, as attempt to put maybe a cherry on the top, if you will, of his argument.
Okay, so what I take from that is that you would still have to show that an inherently beneficial use is that the site is still suitable despite the deviations for an inherently beneficial use.
That would be my understanding. I'll be honest, I don't know if the fact that it's inherently beneficial, again, if it was a use variance, a D1 use variance, my understanding of the case law is that the positive criteria is presumptively satisfied, so they don't have to prove that the site is particularly suitable. I think using that rationale, if you will, I don't know what I'll be honest with you. I don't know what the case law is with respect to inherently beneficial uses for conditional use variances. But if for a D1 use variance, if the positive criteria is to be presumptively satisfied for an inherently beneficial use, and a D1 variance is a higher variance than a D3 variance, then it would seem logical to me that if it's an inherently beneficial use, then yes, I think the positive criteria is presumptively satisfied for a D3 conditional use variance.
And I'll further that, Mark, your analysis is correct because that's what the Coventry Square Court talked about. So, and it pertains to the positive criteria of a D3 variance, Coventry Square versus Westwood Board of Adjustment, that's 138 NJ 285 of 1994. It must focus on whether the site remains appropriate for the conditional use despite the failure to conform to all the ordinance conditions. Okay, quoting here, this does not require a finding that the site is particularly suited for the use, as in the case with a D1 use variance, it at 297. This is so because the use is permitted, albeit conditionally. and it is the conditions attached to the use from which the deviations are sought. So I think that that's the board's focus. What are the conditions that are not met in the ordinance, and the deviations being requested are the focus, and does the site remain appropriate despite those deviations? Site inherently beneficial use, to Mark's point, I made the point earlier, it appeared to me that it was Mr. O'Brien's attempt to wear both the belt and the suspenders on this application. And that was my understanding of that. The D3 requires, under Coventry, a little bit different of an analysis. And to Mr. Healy's point, the D1 standard is a higher standard than the D3 standard.
That's absolutely correct, but Coventry didn't involve an inherently beneficial use, and so the question is, are inherently beneficial uses treated differently for D3s with respect to the positive criteria? And I'm not clear from what you've said, from what Mr. Healy said, I take that to mean that you still have to show that the site remains suitable despite the deviations. And it's my view that Mr. O'Brien's testimony didn't extend to that, although he went through very thoroughly the seeker test and other factors and criteria which are related, but are addressed under the negative criteria. So it's a technical point. I think there is some need for clarity, maybe at the legislative level. But it's my understanding that inherently beneficial uses, based on the statement in Cox, I think you could reasonably conclude that the doctrine isn't treated the same way for a D3 as it is for a D1. And what we've been talking about, what Mr. Bryan talked about, was a D1 standard, where inherently beneficial uses are given a favorable presumption, which it's my position that doesn't apply for a D3. So.
If I may, I would just reiterate my original commentary in the beginning, in which I did state, and I'll quote myself and I'll quote Bill Cox again on page 746, a conditional use variance applicant must show that the site will accommodate the problems associated with the use. That is a given. I have no argument with you whatsoever on that. In terms of inherently beneficial use, this skews the balance in that the negative criteria are addressed through the seeker balancing test, which a D1 use variance would not go through unless it was an inherently beneficial use.
Fair enough. I want to go back to the parking, which has been sort of a focal point of this. And I think there's been a lot of questions around the variance request and the fact that the ordinance requires significantly more parking spaces based on the square footage of the worship area. That's what's driving the required number of parking spaces of 457 spaces. And I want to point out that the ordinance could have made an exception. Well, I appreciate Mr. Lagana pointing out that the ordinance contemplates different types of worship.
Ms. Bailey, is there a question here, ma'am?
There is.
Okay.
It contemplates different types of worship, but it also doesn't make an exception in terms of the parking spaces required based on square footage and the most conservative standard. So there's a variance. The variance that's been requested is substantial. It's you do it by percentage, it's 66%. Would you agree that's a substantial variance, Mr. O'Brien?
No.
What would be your threshold for a substantial variance, if not more than 50%?
I can say that this is not substantial.
Okay, what would be substantial in your mind?
That depends upon a lot of factors. The unique circumstances concerning this application, and as the board knows, every application stands on its own unique circumstances in which the board is to consider whether or not relief can be granted or not. Under these unique circumstances, I do not believe that this is substantial.
Okay, fair enough. But if you took this a little bit further and you conducted a thought experiment and just looking at the plan, which helpfully is still up on the screen here, if you just tripled the size of the parking lot, and let's just take the larger parking lot, you would have a significantly increased impervious coverage on this site. You would actually approach 40% if you did the calculation. Now, it occurred to me to clarify another point, which is that the impervious coverage here has been listed as 40%. And I'm looking now at the zone table on the site plan where the impervious coverage here that's required is listed at 40%. I wonder if you can clarify something for me because it's not clear to me. The conditional use provision, which refers to impervious coverage, actually states that impervious coverage shall be permitted to be 2 times the allowable percent in the applicable residential zone and should comply with the applicable percent in non-residential zones and the HD zone. This is an A zone, which is a non-residential zone. Just looking at the schedule.
I'm going to object. Mr. Healy had already indicated originally that the A zone is a residential zone, and therefore the 40% applies. And if what Ms. Bailey is suggesting is that we need to provide 456 parking spaces, right now our impervious coverage is 18.6% when we are allowed to go to 40%. So while Ms. Bailey has been for the last 7 months saying the site is too intensely developed, now she's suggesting that we should put another 200 parking spaces on there, which we can do.
No, I'm suggesting, with all due respect, I'm suggesting that this application presents a basic problem, which is that you're forcing the board to decide between one variance or possibly a second variance, because if the variance for parking is not granted, then you potentially trigger another variance for the parking requirement. That's my point.
The parking requirement of 450 spaces could be met with the impervious coverage that we now have and what we are allowed. But as has already been indicated by Mr. Healy in his questioning of me earlier this evening, where he indicates, do we even need the 156 spaces? I can't understand why you're arguing that we should put 450 spaces on the site because the ordinance requires it. I think Mr. O'Brien is correct. In this case, we don't need them.
Right. Well, the point of having an ordinance that requires parking spaces and requiring a variance is to make it more difficult to change land use that's been determined by a legislative body, and that's why we're having this discussion at all.
Ms. Bailey, I'm just going to pump the brakes on this for a second. Mr. O'Brien is a planner. It sounds like you're going into some engineering testimony regarding impervious coverage and the need for parking. Again, you have your case in chief that you can call any witness that you like. I think this is going a bit outside the purview of Mr. O'Brien's testimony. So
okay, I wanted to understand why the A zone is considered a residential zone.
It's considered a residential zone because single-family homes are principal permitted use.
Okay, where in the ordinance does it provide
Schedule
that?
Schedule 1 permitted use.
Okay. Okay, it would be helpful if that had been clarified, but clearly it led to some confusion, at least on my.
I would note that statement is in Mr. Healy's report.
I'm sorry, which statement?
About the A zone.
That it's a residential zone, you mean?
Yep.
I did not see that, so I apologize. I just wanted to ask you about the scenic corridor criteria. Is it your testimony that this proposed application and development is consistent with the scenic corridor criteria?
Not only is it consistent with the scenic corridor criteria, but the applicant's attempts to maintain the scenic corridor and enhance the scenic corridor have led to some of the variances that the board is considering. We could come in with a conforming application in terms of parking, lot cover, and remove the variances that are being requested if we wanted to, and if the board would have very little choice about it. But instead, we're trying to balance the needs of the neighbors and the scenic corridor against against the betterment of this application, and putting in self-imposed variances by trying to make this a better application for the township and the neighbors. The treatment of the scenic corridor in terms of the landscaping, the change in the location of the driveway, the closing off of the old driveway, that all enhances the scenic corridor. We're trying to work with the township on that and maintain that.
I appreciate that, but I think there's a lot of people out there who would disagree with that statement. If there's a conflict between the scenic corridor criteria and the zoning ordinance standards, which governs?
It's all part of the balance, Ms. Bailey.
Okay, so that's a decision that the board makes, taking into consideration the factors that you've outlined and the other issues that you've described in the criteria.
Well, isn't that the reason we're here tonight? This board is going to listen to all of our testimony, and they're going to make the decision because they are the citizens who know this area, who know this township the best, and that's why they are empowered to make these decisions. And this board, in its wisdom over the last many, many years I've worked with them, have always taken into consideration the balance, the various balancing needs of the ordinance, the master plan, the land use law, the application, the township, the residents. I mean, this is what this board does.
Right, it's a difficult balancing test. I see that.
You have to admire the board and its officers. They do a great job at this.
Right.
Even when they vote against it sometimes.
I think part of the problem from the perspective of the objecting parties and others is that the site plan has been designed partly around the existing building, and if that were not an issue, there'd be more flexibility and you wouldn't need the variances. Certainly not the setback from the rear.
We can move the building. We can put it back where it was. That's not a problem. We can remove those two variances. That's not a problem. But we don't want to do that because we want to preserve the scenic corridor and we want to preserve the ambiance of the neighbors. It's not a problem coming in with a conforming.
I think they would disagree that that's preserving the ambience of the neighbors. They're going to have a 35-foot structure. That's...
You're asking me questions or you're going to make statements? What do you want to do here?
Well, you've just stated that you can move the building. Then why don't you move the building and eliminate the variance?
Counselor, and Mr. O'Brien, please engage in a cross-examination of the plaintiff. I don't want a back and forth argumentative session here, okay?
My clients are wondering, and I'd like to know because this has never been, I think, clearly answered, is why it is the building, the principal structure, cannot be moved to avoid the variance.
It can be.
Can I clarify? Mr. Lanford, let me just try to provide a little bit of clarification because I'm not sure if it was made completely clear by Mr. O'Brien what he means by move the building. I believe what he means is when you're looking at the plan that's up on the screen there, there's that open field, which is the upper right-hand corner of the site. And you see where the driveway is going through, from right to left. Around that same area, you have those dashed lines, which are, I believe those are the setback lines that would apply. And Mr. O'Brien, you can correct me if I'm wrong. I think what you mean by you can move the building, you could move that building and put it in that open field, much closer to South Middlebush Road and much more visible from South Middlebush Road. But you could move that building in that open field within that building envelope and comply with the setbacks and therefore not need the variances that you're requesting.
That is correct, Mr. Healy. I'm sorry I did not make that clear. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. O'Brien. No further questions.
Mr. Chairman, there's the other counsel, if she wishes to ask any questions. Ms. Norwich.
Thank you very much. Jennifer Kinetic from Price Beach Film and India Armenia on behalf of the neighbors, Mary Ellen and John Warwick. Good evening, Mr. O'Brien. How are you?
Very well. Good evening. And how are you doing?
Good, good. I'll keep it short because I know you've been testifying for a couple hours now.
This is what I do for my living. You can
This is what I
as
do for a
long as
living.
you wish, whatever it
We
takes.
all do this for fun, right?
Right.
Just a question for you. Is there a definition of, there is a definition, I know there's a definition for a church in the ordinance itself. Is there a definition for similar places of worship that you're aware of? That specifically defines what a similar place of worship is?
I do not recall off the top of my head. I'm sorry. I can look that up if there is a question about it.
Yeah, if you don't mind. I mean, I looked at in the definitions and I didn't see it. I just want to confirm that whether there is or there isn't, because obviously with the conditional use standards speak to churches and other similar places of worship.
While I do that, Mr. Healy, do you want to weigh in? Do you know off the top of your head?
I'm searching for it right now.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Hiller.
Okay, there is a definition of church, a building or structure or group of buildings or structures where persons regularly assemble for worship, which by design and construction are primarily intended for the conducting of organized religious services and accessory uses associated therewith.
But you don't
do
see
not-
a definition for place of worship. Similar places of worship.
I would think that's somewhat redundant language. I think for the purpose of the ordinance, a church and a place of worship are one and the same.
Mr. O'Brien, would it be your position that the dwelling that will remain, the existing dwelling, do you consider that a principal use as well or an accessory use?
I think that there are going to be two principal uses on this lot, but I don't know if Mr. Healy's made a ruling on that.
The ordinance allows residences as accessory uses. The principal use in our position in filling out the application is the house of worship. The residence for the priest is accessory to that, and it is permitted.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. In the section of provision for accessory buildings, under section 112-16 of the ordinance, subsection D, it states no accessory building erected in a required yard on any lot within any zone shall be used for residential purposes. Do you believe that this accessory building complies with that section of the code?
Yes.
And lastly, there was mention in your testimony that the relocation of the building as initially proposed was a suggestion from the township. One of the proponents of having to move the building was a suggestion from the township. I don't see that in any of the board professionals' reports with respect to moving the building. Do you have any knowledge of where that request came from?
Perhaps I can answer that question since I was involved in the initial meetings. Mr. O'Brien was not. When the applicant first retained Mr. Ardman to prepare a site plan for this application, he prepared a site plan which showed the building in the area that Mr. Healy just referred to in the front of the property, but meeting the setback requirements closer to South Middlebush Road with the parking behind it. We did meet at least on one occasion, I think maybe more than one occasion, with township staff, including planning, zoning, and engineering, which is often done before a formal application is submitted. And as a result of those meetings with staff, they suggested because of the scenic corridor that they would have preferred that the building be moved to where we moved it originally and then moved it further forward as a result of the revised plan by Mr. Ordman. So there was no formal application with the building in the front. There was a plan that was drafted. We showed it to the town, and based on discussions with the town, we then submitted the formal plan with the building to the rear of the property.
And I would add, if I may, Mr. Lanford, that in Mr. Healy's report, he does write, and I quote, "In my opinion, the overall site layout is consistent with the scenic corridor ordinance."
Understood. Thank you very much. I have no further questions.
Thank you.
Okay, I guess now we can open to the public. And maybe as Mark is deciding what hands are up and people wish to speak, I want to remind everybody that this is a questioning session for the public. You're asking questions, planning questions concerning the testimony of Mr. O'Brien. This is not venting your opinion or moving on to other areas like specifically traffic or whatever, unless it was addressed by Mr. O'Brien. This is a limited questioning period.
Just as the board and the opposing attorneys have kept it to the questioning of Mr. O'Brien. So the first hand that went up is call-in area code 908-305. I will unmute you now and ask that you provide your name and address. Go ahead, you're unmuted.
Yes, thank you very much. My name is Jim Johnston, 34 Norwich Place. How are you?
Good evening, Mr. Johnston. How are you?
Okay, very good. Okay, I heard you mention a number of times that you could move the building to an open field. Okay, an open field, and when you said that, that made me think that you would not have to cut down any forest to do that. Am I correct? I mean, because the impression I've been getting all along is that the plans were to cut down a large forested area. I don't know, maybe what, 12 acres of forest and all the indigenous wildlife in there. But now when I hear you say you can move it to an open field, does that mean that you won't have to cut down any forest?
Mr. Johnston, the comment was made in response to the question concerning why the variances were needed. And the variances for the conditional use are needed because we put the building to the rear of the site out of the scenic corridor. Now, this is a 16-acre site. Your statement that 12 acres are going to be clear cut, I do not believe are true. I do not know exactly how many trees will be removed. That's an engineering question. So I can't speak about the premise of your question in terms of how many trees would be saved by moving it to the open field. One of the parts of that question, though, would be, does the board want it in the open field where it would be completely visible along the scenic corridor and completely visible to the neighbors?
I see what you're saying. It's good. So it's going to be a trade-off, well, one way or the other. Okay.
It's a lot of things to balance here, sir.
Yeah. Well, that was my question. So I'm concerned about the being a scenic corridor and keeping it looking like a scenic corridor, but at the same time, I don't want to, because there's a lot of that whole area has a lot of forest in there with all the indigenous wildlife and everything. The bald eagles and the great blue herons and and so forth. So I'm just trying to get a handle on what's going to happen.
Sure.
Okay.
And not only are we
Yeah.
preserving the scenic corridor, Mr. Johnston, but we are actually enhancing it by adding landscaping, removing an existing driveway.
If I may also add, Mr. Johnson, we are not taking out all of the trees on the property as you suggested. We are removing trees, there's no question about it, to build the church and to build a parking lot, but there are other trees that will be remaining on the site. We are only going to take out the trees that we absolutely need to, and those that we can preserve, we will preserve.
Okay. All right. Okay. Well, that's my question, and I thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Okay.
Thank you. Okay, so scanning. Okay, let's see, Greg Foster. Go ahead. Just
Hi,
provide your name and address, please.
Greg Foster, 39 Labette Drive. I'm wondering, because you're talking about moving the building so much tonight, why can't the building stay where it is on this diagram that I'm looking at right now, but keeping the 200-foot requirement border, not the 130 feet that you're looking for?
It would then, Mr. Ardman testified to that, I think it was 3 meetings ago, but then it would impact the house. We can't move it up any closer, otherwise the house would be impacted.
Well, then, you're looking to vary because of convenience, really, is what it sounds like. If you want to keep the house for the preacher and put the building where it's going to affect the farm that's encroaching.
Well, again, I think Mr. O'Brien gave the justification for the encroachment, and the board's gonna have to decide whether the justification for the encroachment is appropriate. Again, we could have put the building in the front and kept the house in the back. We wouldn't have that encroachment either.
Okay, and the other thing that I'm still trying to figure out, which has not been addressed, is why does a 1-floor building need 35 feet in height? And keeping in turn in the scenic, you will still see it from South Middlebush Road over the trees without a question.
It meets the height requirement of the ordinance. We are under that, and the applicant has chosen to make the height that size. Quite frankly, if somebody were to build a single-family house and would not need any zoning approvals, they can build a house in that open front field, and that house can be 35 feet in height. We are no higher than the size of a house.
I've have never seen a 1-floor house that's 35 feet, so I'm a little confused.
I'm not saying it's a 1-floor house, but a house can be 35 feet and it can be 2 stories.
But this is supposed to be a 1-story building, so that's why I'm confused.
Right, and again, the architect testified, there's a stage, it's an open area, it is not a house, and to have the building be comfortable for the congregants, it chose to make it 35 feet in height, and it complies with the ordinance.
All right, not happy with that, but I did ask, so we'll go on from there. Thank you.
If this were a different type of religion, you could actually have a steeple or other type of roof accessory that would exceed that height and could be quite visible from an area around.
Yes, that's true. However,
we're not proposing that. We're proposing what's allowed by the ordinance.
I'm sorry, I'm still confused that 35 feet is allowed for 1 floor. But,
35 feet is allowed for a structure.
All right, and you're keeping it back so that you won't violate the senior corridor, is that correct?
That's correct.
But don't you think the 35 feet would violate it? Because you can see it from all over the places behind and on the side and from South Middlebush.
I seriously doubt if this is going to be seen in any way, sir, given not only the existing trees that are there, the distance, the hundreds of feet between the roadway and the temple, the buildings that are in front of us, the farm on the other side. I seriously doubt you're going to be able to see this at all, sir.
Well, that might be true for the summer, but I don't know necessarily about in the winter.
Plus, we are adding landscaping along South Middlebush to eliminate the possibility of this being seen.
That's interesting because I think it's going to take a couple of years for the landscaping to get up high enough to block it.
The engineer did testify about the size of the proposed plantings. I don't recall them right now. Mr. Lanford, do you recall?
No, I do not,
But his testimony was that it was adequate to adequately buffer.
Any additional questions, Mr. Foster?
That's it at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Foster.
Okay, so I have Leah Convery. Go ahead, you're unmuted.
Yes, this is Leah Convery, 43 Townsend Court, Franklin Park. You talked about inherent value. Can you explain inherent value? Is it the state, the county, the community?
I can categorically say, Ms. Convery, I did not use the term inherently value at any point this evening.
When you were talking about the classifications of religious buildings are inherently beneficial.
That's correct. I used that term. Thank you.
So is that in regards to the state, the county, the town? And if it's not beneficial to the town, does that carry weight versus its inherent benefit to the county and the state?
The state of New Jersey in the municipal land use law, which is an act that governs all 565 municipalities, finds that a house of worship is an inherently beneficial use.
Okay, thank you. Nothing further.
Okay, thank you. Any other public? Mr. Chairman, I'm not seeing anybody else raising their hand at this time.
Okay, we'll close to the public. Now, Mr. Lanford, that would be your concluding witness, correct?
at this juncture, yes, I understand from Ms. Bailey that she intends to call witnesses. I would reserve the right to recall or witnesses that have previously testified after they testify, or bring in additional witnesses. But at this juncture, I have concluded my presentation.
Mr. Thomas, I'm sorry. I do see Barbara Lawrence with her hand up, and I do believe she had her hand up before. So I just want to make sure we call on her since I think I may have skipped her.
All right, we'll reopen to the public for this member that
Ms. Lawrence, do you have a question?
Yes.
Can we have an address, please?
Oh, 383 South Middlebush Road.
Thank you.
Okay, go ahead.
The ordinances and the scenic byway and all the different criteria that the board here will have to weigh. The Township Master Plan has really advocated for open space and agricultural use and rural use. Can you explain where the Township Master Plan fits into this balancing act?
Yes, of course. I don't believe that it's actually necessary because the positive criteria are met by this application. However, in my testimony, I did indicate that I offered that testimony as an additional justification for the board in reviewing this application. The 2006 master plan on page 1 of the community facilities element does have a goal of providing adequate community services and facilities, to serve the needs of all current and future residents in the township. So this does meet the goals of the master plan. You did point out the scenic corridor goals, and by adjusting this application from its original status to where it is currently is a very deep recognition of the importance of that scenic corridor, which also meets those goals of the master plan.
Thank you, but there are also goals in the master plan that relate to keeping rural areas rural. So the community service part of the master plan is one criteria, but there are others that weigh on the other side.
Not necessarily, ma'am, because this is an allowed use in this zone. The governing body anticipated that a church could go here. A house of worship could go here. So any goals of the master plan could not supersede what the ordinance actually says. So when they're referring to keeping rural areas rural, I believe they're talking about what currently exists and where it is zoned for rural areas. This particular area is zoned for this house of worship. So this is an allowed use here. It's not like we're taking away from a rural area at all.
I guess that may be true legally, but when I look at all the aspects of the master plan that support rural areas and agriculture, it does not seem to fit. But what you're saying then is that the ordinance supersedes the master plan, because that puts it into practice, I guess.
The master plan is a document that is written to show the vision for a community. The ordinance is written to take that vision and put it into nuts and bolts of practice.
Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions?
No, I think, again, I think we opened it up because I believe I had missed Ms. Lawrence before, but there was nobody at the time we closed it.
Okay, then we now will close the public. And then getting back to you, Mr. Lanford, I understand, as you were mentioning, the objectors' attorneys have intentions of calling witnesses. One I understand is environmental witness, another one is a traffic witness. I think this was presented rather at the 11th hour. Do you have any of those people available if you want to be calling a rebuttal witness?
Mr. Chairman, I don't know what I'm going to do because I have not heard their testimony, nor have they submitted a report to the board. So until they do one or both, and after they testify, I will then make a determination as to whether I need to call any additional witnesses. But I can't make that determination this evening.
My question is, if we started that this evening, would any of those people be available to you if they were needed? Any of your
my witnesses? I don't think it would be appropriate. I mean, if you want to start the testimony of any of Ms. Bailey's witnesses, you can go right ahead, but I would reserve the right to cross-examine them at a later date, since I have not had an opportunity to hear their testimony or review any reports. Or we could start it at the next meeting. That's your call.
My preference at this point is end it where we are, have the other witnesses, and have a chance to actually conclude this after over a year at the next meeting.
Well, I can only say that obviously after Ms. Bailey presents her witnesses, I can make a decision as to whether I need to cross-examine them or I need time to cross-examine them. Again, I haven't heard their
I'm
testimony.
not being clear. I'm not trying to inhibit your
Right.
cross-examining him. I don't want to start something at 10 o'clock at night that we leave hanging.
I
That's all.
agree. Perhaps Ms. Bailey can join in this conversation. I don't know if she intends to have her client submit a report in advance of the next meeting, or how we, and perhaps council can join in too, on how we want to handle the next meeting and when it's going to be.
Certainly, thanks. And just to be clear, the witnesses actually, we have potentially 3 witnesses who actually represent both of the objectors. So Jen and I, Jen, who's representing the other objectors, would be handling this jointly. So I think maybe she should chime in here as well.
Yep,
I think
I'm here.
given the issue that you may not have a chance to rebut testimony if a report hasn't been provided in advance, certainly it would be in everyone's interest that we provide that so that we don't have any more delay. And so we certainly can endeavor to do that. That wouldn't be a problem. And that would save, any additional delay because you don't have a chance to prepare.
The other, again, Mr. Lagana, the other option may be that you present your witnesses at the next meeting, and then I would reserve at the following meeting to cross-examine them or bring counter witnesses. And maybe you present all of your 3 witnesses at the next meeting.
I understand the efficiency of doing that. The problem that I might have is now that I'm just learning now that there might be a 3rd witness. We've been pretty diligent as the board to hear 1 witness at a time to keep the record clean, so that way we can do cross-examination and the questioning from the public. Considering we're in 7 meetings, I want to keep this record as clean as possible. To do the direct examination of 3 witnesses followed by the cross-examination of 3 witnesses is going to muddy that. I would prefer Ms. Bailey's option, that she gets some reports from these witnesses to you in an expedited manner, so you have the ability to prepare for that cross-examination so that we can move smoothly as we've been moving through these witnesses.
I have no problem with that either, Mr. Lagana. Again, I would like to get this to the finish line as quickly as possible.
I think that will also help with the, being efficient and expeditious in concluding, moving through the objectives portion of this case. That's the holdup, is that you don't have the information necessary to conduct a proper cross-examination ahead of time. I believe that it's fair that you get that information. I agree with Ms. Bailey's approach there. So I think that will behoove the board, Mr. Chairman, to proceed in that manner.
Let's make that commitment.
Can I also inquire? I think the email that we saw from Ms. Bailey indicated that she had a traffic consultant and an environmental consultant. Who was the 3rd witness?
A planner.
A planner.
Okay. All right. It probably would help if we did get reports, and it may help move the matter along.
Okay, can we do this in a timely manner? Ms. Bailey?
Certainly, yeah, we will submit the reports as quickly as we can. There's been a lot of work done already, so I don't see a problem with facilitating that.
Okay, then what kind of date are we looking at, Mark or Christine?
I'm sorry, Bob, what was the question?
What kind of scheduling can we look forward to?
Well, as of right now, oh, go ahead, Chris.
Right now, we have another hearing that was already scheduled for June 3rd. That is going to take up that whole meeting. So we cannot move anything to June 3rd. After June 3rd, currently I have 2 matters scheduled for June 17th, one being Sci Data, which we have pushed along as Data Bagwan has taken that spot. And the other one is a smaller, but it is already noticed for June 17th. July 1st, we had side data only penciled in, assuming that it was going to be carried. And we have two other matters on that evening. If you had to move Dada Bagwan or something, that would be full as well. So we can't do too much more on July 1st. And July 15th, we're holding for Cedar Hill, which is Mr. Lanford's if he chooses to move that ahead. And then August, there's nothing showing at this time.
Well, I would think that before we start, and I hate to say, because side data is also my application, but I would think the board would want to finish this application before they start the other temple application. I think that would make the most sense. If we can move this to the 17th, assuming I can get reports and have time to review them with my professionals. And I think we could do that and then move side data to the first meeting in July.
Ms. Bailey, are you okay with, do you feel you'll have the reports? Only because when I make the announcement this evening for people, I don't want to have to change it. You know, I have no way of contacting people who are calling in. So do you feel confident that moving this matter to June 17th would be okay?
Yes.
And I
Okay.
have no problem with that as well.
Jen, you're okay with that? Yeah.
I'm
Yeah, I have no
sorry.
problem with that as well.
Okay,
So if you're, I will bring up the screen for people listening for the meeting for June 17th. I think I already. Okay, for those members of the public that are listening on the phone and on WebEx, this matter, Dada Bagwan, ZBA 19-00040, has been carried as of this evening to June 17th, which is a Thursday at 7:30 in the evening. It will be carried into that time. At the top of the screen, which is probably difficult for you all to see, you can gain access to this meeting by going to the Franklin Township website link, which is the easiest way to get in. That web link is www.thewordfranklin.org/home/event/1756/2193. That will gain you the large link that you see there in orange on the screen. Anybody calling in may call through 408-418-9388, and you will have to put in access code 173-687-7054. A summation of this agenda will be placed on the Franklin Township website no later than next Monday. And at that time, all of this information will be on that agenda, so you can copy it down at that juncture. If you do not have access to a computer and you wish to call me directly, you can reach me at 732-873-2500. My extension is 6215.
Okay,
Thomas.
any other business? All right, if not, we'll adjourn the meeting and everyone have a nice weekend.
Before everybody goes, it's the recording secretary made a comment. It's very difficult to hear some of you, as you heard, Mark. Mr. Thomas, he asked you to speak more closely to the mic. I appreciate everybody staying muted. Mark and I both have monitored. We appreciate you guys staying muted to take some of the noise away. But again, if you could speak clearly into your monitor so that she can hear you, it helps her prepare the minutes for Mr. Lagana to do the resolutions and for the, if they're ever Oprah'd, and especially with these meetings being so high intense, it's very important that she can hear so that she can get the minutes correct, okay?
Very good.
All right, thank you, everybody. Have a good night.